Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. This session's real-world troubleshooting tips and tricks from the trenches. DBI 314 is the code, so hopefully everybody's found the right room after lunch. And I do hope everybody is enjoying today as TechEd and getting the most out of these sessions. So my name's Matt Lavery. I'm a Premier Field Engineer for Microsoft, so my specialty is SQL Server. And I spend a lot of my work time out helping customers in the field and working on performance issues. And a lot of the concepts that I want to show you today is really just about the tool sets and methods that I use on site to gain access. And largely a lot of the things I wish I knew back before I started at Microsoft and when I was out in, as a DBA. So a few of the things that I want to cover. Yeah, performance troubleshooting, it's the number one thing that everyone the main question I always get asked is what sort of tools and methods to gain access. And everybody, I can spend a week talking about the real low-level details of performance tuning a system, but really it's when you show tools and methods for gathering the data, that's what people seem most interested in. So that's why I thought I'd throw this session together. So we'll certainly take some time and look at the different tools, both built-in and add-on tools that are readily out there and been out there for a while now, but still not many people are aware of them, so we'll jump into that. I'll also show you how we can use extended events now in SQL 2012 and really start to use additional methods to analyze the performance data from that to gain greater insight into what's happening on your database servers. And finally, hopefully we have time, but a few years ago there was some SQL injection attacks, and certainly with the changes in today's app designs and everything moving up to be available on the web. So this is certainly something that people need to be available, or be aware of, sorry. I've got a little demo I'll show, just exactly how people did exploit database servers with that technique, and just give you some awareness of it. So, but I'm going to try to make this as interactive as possible. But so one of the reasons that I thought I'd talk about this is because I really like a calm day at work, and a day at work where I'm sitting just thinking about driving around in a tinny out on the bay, not really having to actually think about work. However, as we all know, things actually end up quite rough. So we're on the Gold Coast, so I thought I'd throw a picture of surfing out there. So things get rough, and that's what I really want to try to show you, some tools that you can use to really dig into what happens under those circumstances. So let's get into our performance troubleshooting. So as I mentioned, my role is largely out on site talking with customers, and there's a lot of performance metrics that we actually covered during that phase, and some of the key performance improvements that I have to touch on, you'll see a lot of these really come down to just general things, but capturing baselines is the number one thing that I still find customers aren't really doing on a regular basis, and it really makes it hard to dig further into performance issues. Hopefully after this you'll know some extra tools that might give you some better baselining aspects. Another one is the memory configuration. So unfortunately I'd love to spend like the entire week talking about all of these in great detail, but I only have an hour, so I just want to give you some key ideas of some of the issues that are top performance improvements that are out there. So the separation of workload, and one thing I will mention on this, and it is more of an infrastructure design sort of issue, but the separation of your data, log, backup files, and tempDB, which I'll mention in a second, is still quite real today. So I still find a number of customers, even where they're combining them into the same partition, and a lot of the time I hear that it's because, well, we've got this shared storage underlying our environment, but even with a shared infrastructure, the separation at the operating system layer of these workloads really will give you greater throughput. And it even allows the underlying storage architecture to then balance out the workloads more appropriately. So again, I don't have time today to get into the full details, but that's another thing. TempDB, so as well as separating it, there's a lot of optimization that we need to do around TempDB, so I'm sort of hoping that people will take away from this and do some further research into these options. And finally, after we start to get down this list, we start to look at database configuration and our query design and even database design. And from some of the tools that we'll go through today, you'll actually see ways that I've been able to identify different performance issues off this list just from looking at performance data. So now, as I've mentioned, I'm going to look at performance tools. And for quite a long time, it's been quite common to use some of the existing ones. And we've got our old favorites there, so Perfmon, Task Manager, Resource Monitor, as it's now being referred to, SQL Profiler even. And all of these are tried and trusted methods for gaining insight into the performance of an environment. However, the tools that I really wanted to talk about are sort of like my new puppy, and they've been around for a little while now because he's about 2, but they're still not widely known, and there's a lot of people still not widely exploiting these and making the most from these tools. So, and those are the dynamic management views, or the DMVs, management data warehouse, which is a built-in tool, and I'll actually run through that, and extended events. And these are still quite often, a lot of people ask me on site, they're like, well, what are these things? How do I use them? Like, they're just not really making the most from these tool sets. So there's also a number of other tools out there, and these are probably the tools that I wish I'd been shown more detail around prior to actually joining Microsoft. So I used to hear about these tool sets, but I never actually got shown what the reports are, what's the outcome. And that's the one thing I really want to show you today, is what you can get from these various tools, because they're all freely available. Everyone's got access to them. PAL, or the performance analysis of logs, is widely used, not just for SQL Server. You can use it across all different technologies. And the SQL Nexus or RML libraries really gives us a greater insight into our SQL performance. And at the end of that, we can even start to use Excel with our Power View and Power Pivot to really drill into what our performance is happening on our SQL Server. So what I want to jump into now, I want to do a lot of demos, so I'm going to switch across to my SQL Server machine. Okay, and on this server, it's just a VM, but I've got 2 instances running on this machine here. And the first thing I'm going to demonstrate is the management data warehouse, because it has been around for the last few releases of SQL Server, and it can give you quite a good insight into just a summary baseline of what's happening on your server. So I've got 2 instances, and we can drill into where the management data warehouse is off the management branch. So for those that need to see it, so we go into management, and then we have this data collection. A lot of people sort of skim over this when they're looking in Management Studio, but within data collection, we can actually set up collection sets for disk usage, our query statistics, and server activity. These are already pre-set up. You just need to log in and actually enable them, and they will start collecting data. Now, there's a few best practices, which I'll just jump into shortly around it, but what I've actually got configured, and I'll jump onto my other instance here, and under management again, we've got data collection. So this is a SQL 2008 R2 instance, and if I have a look at my query statistics properties, so I'll have to come out of my zoomed mode for this one, but these are just the properties of it. And now, it only takes a matter of 5 minutes to run through this, but in the interest of time, to run through the wizard to actually set this up. Now, this is the default setup, and if I go into my uploads property, you can actually see that under the server tab, I'm actually directing all of the data back to the main instance of SQL. So I've actually got both instances pushing back into the one management data warehouse. So you can have any number of servers pushing back. I've seen one customer that was actually exploiting this quite well. He had, I think, upwards of about 50 odd servers pointing back in. And the only thing I will mention if you do start using multiple instances with this is when we're in our uploads is to make sure that we actually have an offset configured for this. And it's really around, like in this case, I've set up a different schedule to offset the times. On each upload, if you don't offset it, you can actually cause deadlocks on your environment because the different schedules are conflicting. So it's just something to be mindful of. But I'll also show you a way to get deadlocks out later so you'll know if it's happening. Now, that's just the data collection process, but the main benefit to running management data warehouse, and without skipping ahead, so I've got it all pointing back to this MDW database, and from the management data warehouse database, I can then jump across to our management data warehouse overview report, and this gives you an idea of just what you can gain out. So it is a summary report. We don't gain a lot of real depth of information out of it, but if I pick one of my instances and say have a look at the server activity, this will give me a sort of an idea of what was happening, and I can drill back through some time frames, so I could jump back to the other day when I might have been running a bit higher of a workload and get a few different things out, and you can drill through the reports. So I've used this report basically just because it is in the product to sit and run in the background and let it just analyze data, and if I get reports of a slowdown, I might, or usually someone will come to you and say, oh, the server was slow about an hour ago. So I can jump in and have a look and see if there was anything happening. Obviously, this doesn't really replace the benefits of SCOM or a full enterprise level monitoring environment, but it does give you the power as a engineer with access to a SQL server to actually capture some data yourself. And there's other aspects we can get out to where we can drill into our disk usage. So some other queries that we might, or reports that might be useful for us is when this does load, it takes a little bit longer than the server data, but this will give us a trend of data file growth, log file growth, and changes across that, which, there we go. Yeah, can be quite useful from just looking at the changes with your data files or databases, and if you've got any issues relating to that. So now we can also get query statistics out with this report, but I'm going to show you other methods for gaining that same data. The benefit to using management data warehouse is that all of the queries and a lot of the data that is collected is quite similar to what we can get using our dynamic management views. And one thing I always suggest to any engineer that's on site or any customers I touch base with is keeping a collection of scripts handy. And these are a number of scripts that I've got set up just for demoing purposes, but I have a repository of about 25 different scripts for different mechanisms that I have, that I take on site with me to investigate any sort of different performance issue. And one in particular is say, top queries. So here I've got a query that's coming through, and I'm using the CTE expression, but where the guts of the data actually comes from is down into the dynamic management view of the DM exec query stats. So using a query like this, and I actually built this query by just searching online, finding something that was similar enough, and then adding to it. And a lot of people, I've even posted this one on my blog, which I'll point out where you can get that from later. But using a query like this, and I can run that against my system, what we end up getting is a list of all the queries, and as I scroll in, we end up with a total execution. And this is data that's just captured alongside SQL Server. So you don't even have to configure anything. It's just captured in the background, and you can go query it. It only lives for the life of since last time you restarted SQL Server. But another tip I will run when I'm on site is a quick query against these sort of statements to find out the average CPU, average I/O, all different mechanisms to drill into what is actually happening on the server itself. And if you go across, you can even get information like the database name and the actual statement. But one other thing you can get out with dynamic management views is our estimated query plan. And I'm just trying to pick the right one, but without being, that'll do. So we can jump through and get straight away into a graphical query plan to drill further in. And this one even tells me I'm missing an index. So these are quite easy ways to drill into it. Now, all of this data is just mechanisms that are built in. But what we can use, and to gain even greater insight into SQL Server's performance and that, there's a few other tools, and I've mentioned the links to them before, that are readily available either off the Microsoft side or Codeplex or out there in plenty of situations. And they allow us to not only collect additional data, but then analyze it at a much greater level. So whenever I'm on site and I get asked to analyze the performance issue, or I should phrase it differently, that has anyone contacted support and been sent a CAB file and been said, collect this data and then send it back to me? Yep, there's a few nodding heads around. So the tool that's actually used to generate that CAB file is readily available on the Codeplex side. So anyone can go in and actually grab this and create their own CAB file. And the tool's called PSS Diag Config Manager, but all it actually is a very simple UI that's been written, but it wraps around SQL Diag Manager, or SQL Diag. So, and for those that aren't aware, SQL Diag is a command line tool that's been included in SQL Server for a number of releases again, and it will capture both a perfmon collector as well as a SQL trace. So you can just simply, and in fact, if I jump into a command line here, and I just run SQL Diag, if I actually use a proper command line, not PowerShell, say yes. Oh yes, that's right, I want to overwrite the output. It'll start just collecting the data and going through its thing and collecting data for me, but I haven't really done anything to configure what data it's collecting. And the hassle that most people have found with, or I certainly found anyway, with SQL Diag was you had to sit and write XML to actually configure what you wanted to capture. And that's where this UI comes in handy. And we can dive into it and pick exactly what perfmon counters we want to collect and what trace events we actually want. It does capture a whole lot of other information that's custom diagnostics. I will tend to turn all of that off, mainly because that's really only useful for the internal support team. But if I was to leave that as is and hit save and generate a CAB file, I'd get the data. But I'm just going to jump straight to where I've already got one for us. And this is the actual results of what I would generate. And here's the XML file that it will create for me, and there's a whole list of perfmon counters in here, and if I get further enough down, it'll actually show me the event log, events for my trace data. So it's actually gone and reconfigured, or pre-configured all of that for me, to the point where if I just hit this command file now, it'll start collecting, again, I didn't clean out my demo machine properly. It'll start collecting a SQL trace and perfmon data, and this is all great. This is how we collect data. It's very simple. I tend to keep just a pre-written collection script like this, and then I'll go and run it on a machine. But that'll sit there and run until, like I just did there, hit Control-C. Now that's all great and well. Anyone can go and collect data, but the tricks I want to show are really where we start to look at how our field engineers, like myself, tend to analyze data. So this output folder is where the trace file as well as the BLG file or the perfmon logs being captured. And if I was just to open that trace file up, it's just going to give me a chronological list of what happened, and that's all good and well. But the same with the perfmon, I could open that up. But there's a few other tools that engineers like myself tend to use when we're on site. And the first one's PAL, or Performance Analysis of Logs. And again, it's another graphical UI that an engineer, Microsoft, wrote, and the support teams use this again for any sort of analysis. The real, and it's a simple wizard, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but it comes with all these pre-populated thresholds, and this is where the real power of it starts to kick in, because we actually get in our reports then, and you'll see this, some threshold values for how where things are performing, and we can use this to baseline our system in a way or look for hotspots. And because it doesn't just focus on SQL Server, this can apply to others. So I could run through that wizard and wait the 30 odd minutes for it to generate the report, or I can come through and I can show you one that's already generated, because anyone can watch me do a wizard, but it's what comes out that really matters. So now when we look at the analysis of my perfmon data that I've pre-generated, you start off with a chronological order of events. I typically go straight past all them, but when we get, once I can scroll this, we start to get into our different counter logs. So you end up with logical disk, memory, network counters, physical disk, processor, then into our SQL Server specific counters. So all of this is just Windows perfmon. But one thing I'll draw your attention to is the fact that over on, not there, up there you'll see it actually has an alerts 58 next to my processor time. So this has come from that threshold file that I've picked when I've gone through. And if I go into that list now, and I'll get out, we can quickly see this has gone and generated a nice graphical chart, so it's very quick for me to consume the data, and I'm all about trying to consume the data as quick as possible, and the graphical data. But I can easily see there that there was definitely a CPU issue happening on my server at this time, and you can see that the workload sort of changed about halfway through, but then it increased again, and then it finally dropped right off. But we can quickly see this, and you get a nice description and that. But I can scroll down and I can get a bit more info, and you get nice breakdown of things in there. The other useful thing that we can then do, we can go, okay, well I had CPU issues, but maybe that was related to disk, and if I go through my disk performance counters, then there was some write activity happening, but if we go up, then go through the reads, there's not a lot there, but going through, we can also, where's the other counter that I had there? So looking at my queue length for my physical disk, it's it's creeping up, but there really wasn't a lot happening, or it wasn't queuing there. So I know that the disk wasn't really at fault. There was some queuing happening on G drive. Happens to be my temp DB. Conveniently, when I ran this, I deliberately didn't optimize my temp DB so that I could have this fire off. But this is just one way that you can get some insight into the server. One what I'm trying to show is just the methods for generating these reports, and then it obviously takes a bit of time to then sit and consume the report and then match up the different counters and go through that. But yeah, there's quite good insights that we get out of those sort of reports. But that's only the perfmon data. Now, we also captured a SQL trace data, and I know back in the day I used to have a nice method for importing the trace file into SQL Server, run a query against it to sort of go through and mash up all the data into some sort of way that I could find out the top query. But there is actually a tool that will do that for you, and it's the RML library set, or SQL Nexus if you want to have a little UI wrap around the import of it. And it's a command line tool, or depending on which way you go, but what we get from that is a nice report, and I'll jump into that to show you once the reporter loads. So again, I've pre-populated this just for the saving time in this, but now I can point that to a database on my 2008 R2 server. Whoop, that won't get me anywhere. R2 and RML demo. And when this loads up, we'll get a nice report here showing the activity, and it's purely based on what the off the SQL trace data. So there was no other data imported here. It's purely just a SQL Server trace file. And you can see here that we get a nice little chart of showing me what the green and brown section through here is all the batches and started and completed, and we can get duration, so is orange. But that's again just performance sort of data. The interesting sort of reports, or my favourite report that comes out of this, is the unique batches. And if I jump into that and come back out, straight away, again, this is gone and taken that trace file and done all the magical analysis, and it's given me nice charts that I can quickly consume again to figure out that what queries are going to be poorly performing. So the top chart being total CPU, then I've got total duration, total reads and total writes. But the common denominator here is my query ID, and that query number between that chart and that chart are static. So I know that if one query is showing up in one of these charts and it's showing up, so now these are, because their duration is fairly similar, but 1, 2, 3 in the top 4 on both charts. So I know that they're probably going to be good candidates to target. Or I can go further down into total reads, and I know that 1 and 2 are high contenders in the total reads, so that's obviously a good spot to target. Or the total writes has a whole lot of different queries listed, so maybe I need to go look at them. But the other thing to pay attention to is also the total executions. So obviously there's some there with 3,000 executions, and they might be there. But this is a very quick way to pinpoint queries. And then if we further down in the report, we actually get the list of what that query text is, and you can drill through and see just what was going on. And if I wanted to, I could click on one. That one might have something useful. And that'll drill into just being specific to that one query. So I've often used this tool set to really drill through and find exact hotspots in the query design. There's a few other interesting things that you can get out of that report, but they're the two main tools that I always use when I'm out on site looking at performance data. And I'll flip back to, so they're the publicly available tools. So some of the interesting things that I have discovered just with those two tools alone. So these charts actually are real life charts that I've taken off off reports that I've generated while on site and obviously scrubbed for this purpose. But in this particular case, there was memory pressure happening. So this is memory pressure external to SQL Server. This is just within the operating system. And we can tell straight away that something's loaded up initially, taken a whole lot of memory away from the operating system. And from that point there, I was looking at it going, okay, there's some issues happening there, and it turned out to be another SQL instance that was misconfigured. It didn't have its maximum memory limit set, and so you had two SQL instances actually fighting back and forth for memory in this particular case. But this was quite quickly, in scrolling through the PAL report, got to this one, quickly went, okay, there's a memory issue, and then dig further into it. In a similar way, I've also discovered that some internal memory pressure. So this is memory pressure within SQL Server itself then. And in this one, I'm looking at the free pages, and you can see that's being a bit more sporadic. But if I'm looking just at free pages, I really am more concerned about what the page life expectancy is looking like. And that was definitely, in this case, jumping around. And I knew that, okay, some caching issues are happening here. There's obviously a lot of activity that's pulling in different data that's not being cached properly. And yeah, so we started to look more at the configuration of the environment plus the queries that we're running. And it started to direct me into what aspect I needed to look at. Some other aspects that I found, so now using the RML toolset, or the SQL Nexus. This chart, we quickly identified that there was one single statement that was being called, 270,000 times, as opposed to everything else had, only up to 1,000 executions. So we actually took this chart straight to a developer group and said to them, you guys need to look at caching that query or something. And they actually turned around and said, no, that's good performance. It used to run 1,000,000 times. And so we... At that point I shrugged and sort of went, okay, well, you still need to do something. But so that was a quick way of identifying just exactly what, was a statement that was causing a hotspot on the server. Sometimes it's not as obvious as that, so similar to my charts before where I've had to go through and you have to then pick a individual query out and start to dig through, pull it into Management Studio, have a look at the execution plan and go through further. But still there's cases in there where we'd probably look. Some of the other report I didn't really show up, but you can actually dig into information around the sort of events that are happening on the server as well. And in this particular case, there was a lot of exceptions happening. And within the report, you can drill through further into what that is. But in this case here, the exceptions that were actually happening were because objects were being, they were either temporary objects which had then been dropped before being called, or they were they'd actually been dropped from the database and they still had queries trying to reference them. So from within the application. So we were able to actually identify more application configuration that way and dig into it further to try to reduce the number of issues. And one discussion that I always have with customers when we're talking about this, these sort of metrics, is being reactive versus being proactive. And the tools that I'm sort of showing you, you have to be sort of like, obviously go and capture the data, so you do have to be a bit proactive in that result. But without having a true baseline of your environment, it's really difficult to pinpoint what's normal and what's abnormal performance, because even with all of these reports that I've shown you how to generate now, even when I still look through them on site, I still have to then go to the customer and say, well, is this normal behavior for your environment? Because there's, obviously different workloads that we're looking at. So I certainly have to give you one takeaway, which is baseline, 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 because it makes life a lot easier. So, and if you don't have tools such as SCOM or more advanced methods for capturing data, then these tools can give you at least some baselining at a entry level. So. Now, if you do happen to have a major issue, and by that, systems crashing, you just can't get to the bottom of it, please don't do what I used to do and think that I could solve everything on my own. Certainly since, I guess, coming over to Microsoft and that, I've learnt just how much the support teams have access to that just public can't get access to. There's, especially when it comes to things like memory dumps, the way we can analyze them internally just doesn't compete with what we can do or what externally you can do. So certainly, grabbing, escalating support where needed. If you're not aware, we can come on site, so if you have access to field engineers like myself, we can, and the case has been escalated, but you're not happy with what's going on, we can certainly come there. But, I can't neglect either the fact that we've got a massive network of partners, MVPs, user groups, forums. There's a massive amount of knowledge out there, and even people in this room can often help. So if, don't think that you're fighting on your own, because you just need to ask for help, and there'll be someone there that can point you in the right direction. So there's some of the tools, but one other tool that has come in under 2012 was extended events. And has many people used extended events in this room to analyze data? A few, yeah. So it has actually been in SQL Server since 2008. And R2, there just wasn't a UI around it, so you didn't have any access to get to it unless you downloaded that add-in, and in which case it would show up under your Object Explorer and you could go and add new captures and everything there. With 2012, there's now a full access to it, so you can go and create your own data captures, and we can filter data, aggregate data. And yep, I'll actually switch back and I'll show you just how simple that really is for those that haven't used it. So, and there is a really big reason why I'm showing this too. So I'll point that out at the after going through this. But so just my 2012 instance, and if we go down to again under management. I'll just get rid of data capture. So we have the extended events aspect, and if I expand out sessions, there's a few here that are existing, and I'll zoom in for those to help there, but the system health is one that's pre-configured. That'll be already running on all your SQL servers, and that one's actually been there running since 2008, so that's the one that's always run in the background. If you configure always on, the always on health will kick in and that'll start to capture data as well. But like what I've done there with my query performance one, we can easily come in and run a new session wizard. Again, I'll have to get out, but it's an intuitive wizard that we could run through and pick even a template here, which would give you a starting point. It's very similar to Profiler in that regard, that you can come through, jump in, and start to collect data around different aspects of the environment. So I'm just going to use one that I've already set up, but the query performance one here, wait for it, there we go. So when I look at events, so very similar to our Profiler, we actually end up with RPC completed, you've got your stored procedure completed, statement completed, batch completed. So these are all events that are, almost translate straight back to Profiler and capture the same sort of data. But this is all within Management Studio, and it's a lot more lightweight than using Profiler. Plus we can get a whole lot, there's a whole lot of more events, like there's this massive long list that go through, but so it's been designed to, well, for starters, there's no actual client that we can sit in between them. So, and I probably neglected to mention that earlier. So The other capture that I used earlier too, where I was talking about SQL diag and its capture, that's a server-side trace. So a lot of people run into some issues when they start running Profiler and they just fire up the client. So if I just fired up the client now, SQL Profiler, if I just connected and went through and started to run it, if I don't come in and actually, yeah, that'll do, tick an option to say let the server process the trace, or write the T-SQL to actually get it to process it, it'll run within the client and adds an extra network hop between the two. So you can actually end up with some latency in that regard, which then impacts your end users that are trying to use the system. So extended events will sit there, and it's been designed around some of the new event capturing technologies within Windows, so it can talk to not only the extended events like client within Management Studio, but you can get other methods for getting the events out too. And so there's been a lot of work put in to really reduce the impact on performance within SQL Server and give us a way of really getting a lot of data out without bringing our system to the knees. So, I already had that open, but so there's a whole lot of events. So the other way we can also do this is we have two options when we're saving extended events data. So you have the event file, which is just, for lack of a better term, it's your trace file. So like in Profiler where we'd save it to a file, that's the event file. And it just saves to your default log directory. We also have the ring buffer, which is a temporary storage, and there's actually a retention process, so it'll just keep the most recent sort of data there. So if you're just looking for current activity, that's a way of quickly, or allowing you to, without writing to the disk, just capture data and still reference it or query it. So now I'm going to start that. And we have the option, once we've started a session, we also have the option to watch live data. And this is quite handy, so it's just like watching Profiler's view. And to make this a bit more interesting, I'm going to fire off a PowerShell script, workload, run workload. And this is just generating some OLTP statements against the server. So we'll see that this will kick in shortly. There we go. So we start to see events kicking in. So this is just like watching Profiler, really. But we start to get a bit more information, so I can click in, and down in the bottom we get the text there and database name, and start to see what's actually being captured. I could add a filter. So all of this is pretty similar to Profiler. But if I stop my data feed on my live watch, all of a sudden I actually get a couple of extra buttons show up, which is grouping and aggregation. And if this is a way that, unlike Profiler, we can now come in and really start to get better information out of the data set. So I might say, okay, group by database name, and query hash might work. Actually, I probably don't need that one. Just say query hash. So query hash is the unique number assigned to each query to help you identify similar queries in the system. And just by grouping that, I can tell that I've got one ignoring 0 because that's just all the used database name statements. But I've got one query here which actually executed twice within that short period of time that I was tracking data, but if this was a longer data set, that would show more information. So, but I can then expand that out, and we can see that, okay, yep, there's the same query running there, and if I wanted to, I could drill in further. I might even add some aggregation, which starts to sum up the, where are we going? Sum the few things I might be interested in. So I might sum up my CPU reads and writes. So then even when I haven't expanded the list, I can then see from this list just what queries might have been consuming data a little heavily. Now, that's a very quick dive into extended events, but there really is a lot we can do with it, and it really does start to give you a lot in there. Now, I mentioned that extended events it was in 2008, and one other aspect that I do a lot of when I'm on site, because I still support obviously a lot of 2008 implementations, and a lot of the times I'll be on site and I'll notice that there's been deadlocking issues happen, and if you've been experiencing deadlocking, you'll know that until now, there was no way to actually get the information out unless you turned on your trace flags or were running a profiled trace at the time that the trace happened, or that the deadlock happened. So one of my colleagues, another SQL PFE, actually put together some PowerShell and SQL scripts that lets you extract out the deadlocks information from the session health event that I showed before on SQL 2008 R2 instances. So if you've ever have a system and it's got a deadlock, you no longer have to worry that, oh, I now have to go set up capture and hope that the deadlock happens again. You can actually bring it out, and I'll show you just how that can work. The slides will be up, so I know people are grabbing them, but that's why I got the link in there. So I can get rid of that now. Just stop that session and stop that one. So deadlocks. So there's a couple of files that make up the ability to get out deadlocks, but one other thing that's useful is we have a I'm on the right instance. We have a dynamic management view. Helps if I flick the right screen. We have a dynamic management view which allows us to actually gain the number of deadlocks that have happened on a system. And if I execute this, so since I last rebuilt this machine, I haven't had a deadlock happen. So I'm going to quickly create one. Give that a few seconds and it should fire off a quick deadlock for me. Cool, okay. So I've just actually created a deadlock, and that's still rolling back, but that's okay. Now I've actually got a deadlock there, so this is one thing I will check when I'm on site to sort of identify if there are deadlocking issues happening. And once you do notice that, what I can do is come back to there's a PowerShell script that I just need to execute, and this is all off that website that you can get to, but I'm going to call a PowerShell script here. Actually, let me closed. And this script's just going to, it's called transform to XDL, but I'm just going to pass it the server name, and then I'm passing it a path which is just locally on my computer there for C drive, just to save files to. It'll go and do its thing. It runs a SQL script in the background, so you can actually dig into how this is being extracted out of extended events, but I'm going to show you that in a second anyway. There we go. And it'll go through and find the deadlock. And if I go to my location that was being saved to, there's a few here that I've already generated, but this one here is the one that just got generated then. And because it's an XDL file, so this is still on SQL 2008 R2 that I was connected to, but because it's an XDL file and I've got the SQL 2012 Management Studio installed on this server, I can actually open that straight up into Management Studio and get a graphical view of what that deadlock happened. So I no longer have to be sort of tracking this or go and find it elsewise. I will often come in and run this on a client system if I've found deadlocks and or found that there have been deadlocks, and then use this to figure out just how the deadlocks or why they're happening. Interestingly, that hint I gave you about the management data warehouse before and the timing of the schedules. So I was on a customer's site and found that there was about 300 odd deadlocks that had happened in the space of a couple of months, and ran this script only to find out that it was the schedules of management data warehouse causing deadlocks on each other. But it was because of this that I managed to get to that information. So I know that the deadlock here was quite simple. It was just two statements that had both within individual transactions selected data and then tried to update each other's data. But it gives you a way of, if you've got major deadlocks happening, a way to get in and really get that information out. So close that window. One of these actually had, I happen to pick the same one, but yeah, there was one there. But now there's one other thing with extended events that can be quite useful, and that's when we start to look at creating reports out of the extended events data. So similar to using those tools to get the reports off the trace data, I often will use Excel, in fact, to analyze my extended events data and really get to some further information. So for anyone starting to look at some of the BI aspects, this is one way, but to be able to even get that data out, I need to firstly run a query. I'll show you this now. So the way that we actually extract data from extended events is using queries. So first off, I've got a statement here, which the only bit to sort of pay attention to is a insert statement there, which just reads the data from that event file that I created earlier, pulls it into a table, and then allows me to sort of process it later. Or I could actually point this straight to the ring buffer, which is that temporary storage, and just get the real, the current live data out. But in this particular case, I wanted to analyze a lot of, about a gig's worth of data. So now when it comes to actually analyzing the data, and so again, I use the CTE query language or definition, and I'm just doing a query off a table I've created just to where I've dumped all the extended events data in. But then I have to use XML because all extended events data gets stored in XML format. I have to use my XML language to extract data out. This is where it becomes a little bit tricky. Again, I had a search online, found someone's script that was sort of similar, grabbed it, came up with something that fit what I needed. So I will be publishing all of these up on my blog, so hence why I haven't thrown them into the slide deck. But once I run this query now, that'll sit there and run. Again, it's similar to like before, where it'll give me a list of all queries by CPU. I think I sorted this by, and so I could go through and I get a list of, okay, well I can figure out then what my highest offending statement might be. But for me, I like things where I can consume that quite quickly. So if I took that statement and actually threw it into Excel And for that, I'm going to jump into my app server and run up one. So if I fire this Excel workbook up, and this is Excel 2013, so it comes with Power View and Power Pivot all there. But if I run Power Pivot, and I'm just going to open up the Manage section of this. So, and when that loads, so just to show, I'll come into the table properties. So this is where I've just got that exact same query that I was running against my SQL database, but I'm just going to pull that data into a Power Pivot table and run it there. So it doesn't take too long, but what I'll actually do is I'll show one which had a bit more info because I won't refresh it, but so the same statement, but once I've got that in Power Pivot, so that was my table there, I can then come across and look at a Power View report, and this is one which is just, again, I guess I am sort of mimicking what those other report tools were giving me, but this is all off extended events data, and this is going to give me a list of my top queries. And because it's Power Pivot, so I can sort of drill into this a little further, but if I get my icon right, I can pop this out. Now I can add a filter on here and bring back my query ID, so I might want to say less than, say 15. So that way I get a bit smaller number there. But again, I can come through and I will typically, these query IDs I've made static. So again, straight away, looking at the data here, and I've got average CPU by query ID or average reads by query ID. And I can tell that, okay, well, query 1 and 2 were my top offenders by CPU, but queries 8 and 17 and 19 were the top offenders by average reads, and so I'd be able to drill further into that. And you know, you can mash these sort of things together whichever way you like, but you know, I tend to sort of end up playing with this very customized on site whenever I needed. But similar to the other methods, I can also get performance metrics out. And just to actually show this, I'm going to recreate that one. So I'll insert a new Power View window. And this is just how quick, so I've already got the data there. Performance metrics, and I might say, okay, I'm going to go event time, and then I'll go total CPU, duration, executions, and reads. So, and that just gives me a straight table, but I might pick a line chart, and all of a sudden that chart that I was just looking at's starting to take shape. And yeah, you can quickly see here that, okay, well, you know, that's just to show you how quick that was to make that chart off using Excel. So this is why Excel has actually become one of my favorite tools while I'm on site now. And I know from looking at this chart that it's the total CPU and duration that's my issue. So if I went back to my queries, I'd go and target the two that are at the top for the CPU. I wouldn't worry about the total reads and writes. So now, let me get out of that one. Come back to this. So one of the main reasons I'm talking about extended events is because if you haven't read the information around that's under SQL Profiler in the books online for SQL 2012, it has been flagged as being depreciated. So, and that's just from the trace capture aspect of it. So the tool's probably going to hang around for, but we don't really know when that's going to happen yet though. So the product team have just flagged that SQL Profiler for the purpose of capturing trace files or trace data will be depreciated, and extended events is going to be the thing that replaces it. So this is why I sort of wanted to really show the similarities between it, because I know firsthand myself it was a bit daunting when you start to get into extended events, but once you get in, start capturing data and start to experiment with it, it does become a lot more familiar to yourself. So a question.
Is extended events going to cover things like analysis services as well?
So at the moment, the official books online says that SQL Profiler is still going to capture analysis services data. Yeah, I don't have any official guidance other than that. Yeah, so that's why it's only stated for OLTP data that profile is going to sort of be dropped back. So, so that's the main tool sets that I tend to use these days whenever I'm out collecting performance data. And what I want to sort of go into now, just for a little bit of a demo, is just around when hackers got smart. And this really kind of happened more around 2008, 2010. There were a couple of occurrences of it. And the main reason I thought I really wanted to explain this is because of the whole drive where a lot of more focus has been around creating apps for the new web apps and really pushing data out into the cloud and everything. And I know that there's a lot of protection that comes with Azure and that, but I'm really looking more around if you're pushing stuff out and you're making your database servers a little bit more vulnerable as far as having applications publicly available and getting through. This is something to be a bit mindful of. I will point out though that what I'm about to show is real. I'm not going to ever release these scripts because that's a straight door into someone's website, but this is the legitimate way that people compromise databases. And so the methods that they used was SQL injection. Ideally, SQL injection is any way of someone gaining unlawful access into a database or compromising the data in a way. It can be as simple as just passing manipulating a password string so that it actually escapes out this query statement to give a true response, so getting in that way. But what I'm going to go through is the method of where they've actually manipulated the database itself via queries. So I guess the most common programming language that was always vulnerable was ASP. And the only highlight that I want on this is really the fact that the request product ID has no sort of validation around it. It's just taking whatever that user says and sending it straight through within our select statement. So I think people could understand that. But it is still common, even within ASP.NET or C#. You can still pass through just straight user input straight through the database without even checking it or doing anything with it, and that's where we can still end up with some issues there. So let's have a look. So I will jump back. So I've got a couple of websites just set up on this app server. And actually they point back to show that this is going to come through. On my SQL server, I've got a database here which is Tailspin Commerce. And there's a few tables there, but this is the database that I'm actually going to exploit through. So now, jump back to a website. So just to give you wrong server. Documents, SQL injection. So SQL injection, just to show you what website. This is just an example one I grabbed because it's very simple, obviously. But if I go to products, we get a list of products. And from the view link, it's passing just a product ID value through, so it's straightforward, and then we get some details around it. So, but what I might do here is maybe I want to modify this so that it'll actually pass a create table statement in, just to sort of test if this site's vulnerable to SQL injection. And I can even do that just straight in the browser window. And now I got data, like, I didn't get an error there, but if I jump into my database now, and this is just to show you that this is actually happening, there's a hacker data table. So this is actually gone through the website code and gone and created a database. Obviously, my security is a little laxed around my user that my website's using, but this is common. It's a database owner, but this is something that could definitely happen. So but maybe I'll do something a bit more sinister. I might want to get in and run some select from the sys tables, or even jump in and go, okay, let's start to query data back from that table. So I'll just run that, and so I didn't get a record back, but that's because I passed back null instead of an ID. But then if I was a little smarter, I might try to actually throw a select statement at the end of this line and try to get back some info. But okay, that didn't work. But the website's actually trapping errors, so I don't see that. But if I send the same thing but use the union statement, so I'm actually going to false the results that come out, I get a list of an output, and obviously this website's very vulnerable, but rather than getting any details, I'm now getting categories, hacker data. Well, that looks familiar. Order details. So these are actual table names. So I've just queried a table that I've created with table names in the database just through the website entry point here. So this is a little, just trying to raise a bit of awareness, but maybe I even want to then start to go, okay, well, what are all my columns on that products table? So I've got product ID, category ID, I can go through. So these are just some of the methods, but what actually happened, so that's typical SQL injection, just exploiting. And there's a lot of filters like within IIS, so I didn't install any other ISAPI filters or anything like on the server to sort of prevent this. There are methods out there that sort of block what I was just showing, but they're all sort of designed to look for specific words like create, drop, delete, those sort of harsh things that website code really shouldn't be sending. But back in that, where they started to get a bit smarter, hackers started sending some binary data through, and it sort of came through rather than writing out a select statement, it came through as this declare statement, and then when it gets through, you'll notice there's an execute bit there, so that would actually get passed in whole straight through to the database server and then execute that statement. And that binary data that's up there isn't legit. If you copy this and run it, it's just going to say something like example for you, but it would translate to something similar to this, which would link through, look at getting all the variable length text columns from a database and a table, and then go and update the data. So the main reason, I wanted to point that out was I'm going to come back now, and let's go back to my products list, and I'm going to use my favorite thing called PowerShell, SQL injection, hack site demo. So I've got a nice sinister script here that's now just going to go and hack this site for me. And when I look at the product list, that's all the same. But if I click view now, all of a sudden I get a pop-up message here and telling me that litware has exploited my site. And once I hit OK, I'm actually taken off to a different site. So again, this is the same sort of technique, but it's just, yeah, I'm just trying to make you aware that these sort of things can happen, and to get people sort of thinking about it again, because, yeah, security is a bit of an issue here. Now, how does that sort of happen? If I go to my database, and I'm just going to have a look at the products table. And you might see under the description value there, there's actually been a JavaScript code thrown in. So obviously this wouldn't work for a standard Windows like desktop app, but for anything that's got a web or browser front end, that would actually fire off and redirect them to that sort of issue there. So, and the only way to really correct that is then to go and restore the database and clean up the data. So there are ways to prevent that, just simply by doing some validation around that parameter, just making sure that it's the right data type. And the main reason, yeah, I got through that. So identification's the real thing that I sort of want to make people aware of, or, different ways. So SQL Server auditing is one way we can start to track for this sort of thing. Using triggers. Back in the day when I was actually a DBA and investigating this, we actually had a custom script that was the same script as what the people used to exploit it, but re-engineered to go and, rather than update and corrupt data, we actually went and looked for tables that had been exploited. And yeah, so there's a few different ways, but if there's anyone with developer interest in the room, but that's really where a lot of the buck stops with, because validation of the parameters, and there are a lot of new frameworks that have come out which sort of prevent this from happening, but certainly anyone that has any sort of dealings with the database and you really want to protect that data, this is something to be aware of. So now, after all that, we can all go back to a calm day at work. So I know I'm still trying to think about now Sunday when I was out fishing. So, and what's up next? So there's a few bits of related content that's going on. Honestly, there's not that much related stuff that talks directly about what I've been going through, but there's a couple of hands-on labs that'll talk about how to do different reporting mechanisms, and obviously using System Center for monitoring. There's a few exams. Certainly the exams are probably where you get closer to the sort of things I'm talking about. If you do want to talk about anything of this, you can find me. I'll be hanging around at the Microsoft Showcase in the Data Insights area, or at the Premier Support stand. Otherwise, you can get my Twitter handle and blog off the speaker portal, and I'll try and upload as much of the scripts as possible, like the extended events things and that, onto that blog for people to gain access to. And obviously, we all want to win things. So if you did find anything that I said useful, and they threw a timer on that slide for some reason, yeah, please fill out the evals. Even if I will read as much as I can and take everything on board. But certainly, yeah, good luck. I hope people win the mouse. I don't know when they were drawing it, but yeah, certainly please try to do that. And there's obviously the resources, so you will be able to get all this info. I'm sure you've all looked at these slides enough today. For those that aren't aware, so there is SQL 2014, the CTP release out there to download. So it's, I don't know when, no one knows when the official launch is, but so yeah, the big feature with that is the in-memory of LTP. We also have obviously our SQL Azure stuff, so if you want to talk about any of that stuff, come and find me later. But other than that, I'll open the floor to any questions. But again, thank you for listening. Yeah, I've enjoyed myself. I hope you learnt some things. Yeah, thank you.